The moment Prince William became the legal owner of one of the oldest and most powerful private estates in Britain, something else happened in that exact same instant, something that barely made the headlines at the time, but carried consequences that are still tearing through the royal family today. Camilla had spent nearly 2 decades quietly filling that estate with her own family, her own people, her own financial arrangements, building what amounted to a private empire inside an institution she did not yet fully control. And the moment that estate transferred to William's hands, every single one of them was gone. Not through confrontation, not through argument, not through any dramatic public announcement. Through one dry financial document that almost nobody reads and one name that simply was no longer there. What William is now preparing to do next has sent Camilla into a position so precarious that sources describe her as genuinely uncertain about where her life goes from here. And what you are about to find out is exactly why she never saw this coming and why, in the end, she may have built the trap herself. Before we go any further, if you follow royal stories with this level of detail, take a moment to subscribe now. What's about to unfold behind these palace walls is far more calculated than anyone let on, and this story is only getting started. But William's actions didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand what he did and why Camilla never saw it coming, we need to go back to one specific moment. A moment the world thought it understood. A moment that changed everything in an instant, and yet whose true consequences took years to fully arrive. On September 8, 2022, a heavy, historic silence fell over Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. As Queen Elizabeth II took her final breath, the world focused on the immediate ascension of King Charles III. It was a moment of profound national mourning and a visible shift in the crown's lineage. Yet, in that same legal instant, a second, quieter revolution was taking place within the machinery of the British monarchy. Without a signature, a public ceremony, or a single word of negotiation, a massive transfer of power occurred. Prince William, at 40 years old, became the sole owner of the Duchy of Cornwall. To the average observer, it was a change in title. To those within the palace, it was the moment the financial center of gravity shifted. The empire that landed in William's hands that day is difficult to comprehend in its sheer scale. Valued at over £1,200,000,000, the duchy is a sprawling private estate covering more than 135,000 acres of land. Its reach extends across 23 counties, encompassing the beautiful Isles of Scilly, the ancient, granite-strewn landscapes of Dartmoor, and a vast collection of historic castles, tenant farms, and high-end commercial properties. This institution was not a modern creation. It was forged in the year 1337 by King Edward III with a very specific, unalterable purpose. The king wanted to ensure that his son, the heir to the throne, would never be financially controlled or pressured by the reigning monarch. For nearly 700 years, this rule has remained unbroken. The moment his father became king, William became a billionaire in his own right, independent of the sovereign's purse and free from the financial oversight of his father's household. For the first time in his life, William was not just a prince, he was a landlord of global proportions. However, as William stepped into his new role and began to examine the inner workings of this massive portfolio, he encountered a specific arrangement that had been quietly running for nearly 20 years. Deep within the duchy's payroll was a woman named Annabel Elliot. To the public, she was a respected interior designer, but within the family, she was known as Queen Camilla's younger sister. She had been hired by Charles in 2005, the very same year he married Camilla. Her appointment had bypassed the usual competitive processes. There were no interviews with rival firms and no transparent evaluations. Her contract was an invisible thread connecting the estate to Camilla's private circle. For 2 decades, Annabel had been the primary designer for duchy properties, from holiday cottages in Cornwall to lavish estates in Wales. She was an established fixture of the old regime, her livelihood directly tied to the man who was now king. But on that afternoon in September, the person signing her paychecks changed. William was now her employer. The son of Diana was now in charge of the financial future of the woman who had been a constant presence in the background of his father's life. The tension was immediate, though hidden behind the polite veneer of royal duty. William's newfound independence meant he was no longer a bystander to his father's decisions. He now held the keys to the kingdom's most lucrative private estate, and his first moves would signal exactly what kind of king he intended to be. But what William was about to do with this power was not merely a matter of business. It was the beginning of an answer to a story that started long before he became a duke, a story of a mother's pain and a promise that had been systematically rewritten. To understand the cold precision of William's next move, one must first understand the system Camilla had built and the emotional price the young princes had been forced to pay for her rise. Long before the headlines about payrolls and estates, there was a private meeting that should have changed the course of the monarchy. In the months leading up to April 2005, Prince William and Prince Harry approached their father with a single, desperate request. They told him they supported his happiness and would welcome the woman he loved into their lives, but they begged him for one thing: please, do not marry her. They knew that a wedding would force the world to revisit the darkest chapters of their childhood. It would drag their mother's name back to the front pages, inviting a cruel comparison between the beloved Princess of Wales and the woman who had been the third person in her marriage for years. Charles listened, but the internal machinery of his desire proved stronger than the pleas of his sons. He married Camilla anyway. To pacify a skeptical public and his own children, the palace issued a formal commitment that seemed unshakable at the time. It was announced that when Charles eventually took the throne, Camilla would not be known as queen. Instead, she would hold the lesser title of princess consort. This was the deal. It was the price paid for public acceptance. William, ever the dutiful heir, stood at the wedding and smiled for the cameras, burying his resentment beneath layers of royal protocol. He was a son who had watched his mother's self-esteem wither away, yet here he was, shaking the hand of the woman who had replaced her. While Prince Harry would later write about these moments with explosive honesty, William chose a different path. He remained silent, but that silence was not an absence of feeling, it was a form of observation. He was recording every shift in the narrative, every moment his father prioritized Camilla's standing over the memory of Diana. For 17 years, that original promise regarding her title remained the official stance of the monarchy. But in February 2022, as the world celebrated the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, the foundation began to shift. Queen Elizabeth II, visibly frail and aware that her reign was nearing its end, released a message that stunned the household. She stated it was her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. To the public, it looked like a final act of forgiveness from a mother to her son. However, those within the inner sanctum of the palace saw it through a darker lens. This was not a blessing, it was a containment strategy. The Queen, who had once privately described Camilla as dangerous, knew that Charles's devotion to his wife was a wildfire she would not be there to manage. By granting the title herself, she was trying to exert a final bit of control over an inevitable storm. But even the Queen's carefully worded concession was not enough for the new era. By the time the coronation arrived in May 2023, the word consort had been quietly surgically removed from the official liturgy. Suddenly, she was simply Queen Camilla. The title that the princes were promised would never exist was now emblazoned on every invitation and news broadcast in the country. William watched as the last remnants of the 2005 agreement were erased, replaced by a new reality he was expected to endorse. The emotional fallout was profound, even if it remained hidden behind palace walls. William had watched the promise get rewritten piece by piece, year by year. He had seen his mother's legacy sidelined to make room for his father's wife. But what nobody realized was that while the title was being elevated, William was waiting for the one thing that titles cannot buy: the power of the purse. The coronation was Camilla's triumph, but it was also the moment the clock began ticking on the system she had spent decades building. What happened inside the palace after that moment has never fully been reported. Camilla did not simply ascend to the throne through a stroke of luck or the natural passage of time. She was a master of the long game, a strategist who understood that within the corridors of royal power, influence is the only true currency. Over the course of 2 decades, she built a sophisticated machinery of institutional control that operated through 2 primary channels that were designed to protect her position while quietly reshaping the family around her. The first channel was the most intimate and arguably the most damaging. It was the power of the whisper. When the heavy doors of the private apartments closed and the staff retreated, Camilla became the primary lens through which King Charles viewed his own children. Royal biographer Christopher Anderson confirmed a pattern that had long been suspected by those within the inner circle. Camilla would frequently share her own assessments of William and Harry's supposed shortcomings, their temperaments, and their motivations. She was not merely a stepmother trying to find her place. She was an architect of opinion, slowly and methodically eroding the bond between a father and his sons to ensure her own influence remained unchallenged. The second channel was her relationship with the British media. For years, Camilla and her team had carefully cultivated a network of sympathetic journalists and editors. This was an operation of both defense and offense. When Camilla needed to be rehabilitated in the eyes of a skeptical public, glowing profiles and insider accounts of her warmth would suddenly appear in the Sunday papers. But when she needed to shift the spotlight away from her own controversies, other members of the family would find themselves facing a barrage of negative press. The most devastating example of this system in action occurred during the preparations for the royal wedding in 2018. A story began to circulate in the tabloids claiming that Meghan Markle had made Catherine cry during a flower girl dress fitting. The narrative was explosive, painting Meghan as difficult and Catherine as the wounded party. It was a story that tore through the British press and caused lasting, irreparable damage to the relationships between the two couples. Within the palace walls, the truth was well known. The story was entirely false. William and Harry went directly to their father, demanding that his communications team issue a formal correction. They presented evidence that the story had been leaked by someone within Charles's own household to favor Camilla's standing. Instead of finding an ally in their father, they met a wall of defensive anger. Charles shouted at William, telling him he was being paranoid and that he should stop attacking the people who served the crown. At that moment, William saw the reality of the system he lived in. His father's loyalty to the machinery Camilla had built was greater than his commitment to the truth or the protection of his sons' families. This was the blueprint of the world William had been forced to navigate, a world where nepotism and media manipulation were treated as standard operating procedures. The arrangement with Annabel Elliot was an extension of this very philosophy. It was a quiet, lucrative contract that required no public explanation and invited no scrutiny. It was an invisible financial thread that wove Camilla's family into the very fabric of the estate William would one day inherit. But what made this financial connection truly unbearable for William was not just the lack of transparency or the cost to the estate. It was a secret buried deep in the past, long before any contracts were ever signed. It was a secret that lived inside the walls of a quiet country house in Dorset, a place that held the key to why this arrangement was an insult to the memory of his mother. To understand William's cold fury, one must look at what happened in that house when the world was looking the other way. Before Annabel Elliot was ever a royal contractor, she served a much more clandestine purpose within the internal geography of the House of Windsor. To understand why her presence on the royal payroll was so combustible for Prince William, one must look back to the 1990s, a decade defined by the slow, public disintegration of the marriage between Charles and Diana. During the years when the affair between Charles and Camilla had to remain a shadow, hidden from the prying eyes of the global press and the disapproval of the Queen, the couple needed a sanctuary. They needed a place where the rules of royal life did not apply and where their secret could be kept behind closed doors. That place was Annabel's home. Tucked away in the quiet Dorset village of Storpane, her country house offered a level of isolation that was impossible to find within the royal palaces. It was a private residence, unreachable by the telephoto lenses that tracked Charles at every official engagement. Weekend after weekend, Annabel provided the cover, the space, and the protection necessary to sustain the relationship. She was the gatekeeper of their secret world, the woman who made the affair possible by offering her own home as its shelter. While this sanctuary existed in Dorset, a very different reality was unfolding for the Princess of Wales. During those same years, Diana was often found by palace staff in moments of profound private collapse. The woman whom the entire world regarded as an icon of beauty and grace was being hollowed out from the inside. There were nights when staff heard muffled crying coming from her room at 3 a.m, a sound that echoed through the grand, cold hallways of Kensington Palace. Those close to her described a woman who was slowly disappearing. She would pull trusted staff members aside, her eyes clouded with a deep-seated fear, and ask them in a quiet, fragile voice, "Am I beautiful enough?" When they assured her that she was, she would simply shake her head and whisper, "Don't lie to the princess." The man she had married had made her feel invisible, and the knowledge that he was choosing another woman over and over again had destroyed her sense of self. William and Harry were not shielded from this. They were the silent witnesses to their mother's heartbreak. They watched her retreat into herself, a little more each day, as the affair in Dorset continued unabated. Decades later, after the tragedy in Paris, after the tears had dried and the crown had passed, a startling irony emerged. Annabel Elliot was being paid a royal salary. Her income was being drawn directly from the Duchy of Cornwall, the very estate that was tied to Diana's children and the legacy of the woman who had suffered so much. The woman whose home had sheltered the affair that dismantled William's family was now collecting a paycheck from the institution his mother had helped build with her own sacrifice. This is the revelation that reframes everything. When William looked at the payroll of his billion-pound estate, he didn't just see an interior designer. He saw a reminder of the Dorset house. He saw the face of the clandestine arrangement that had cost his mother her happiness and, eventually, her place in the world. The question for the audience is no longer about financial efficiency. It is a question of moral architecture. Was William's eventual move to remove her a matter of institutional housekeeping, or was it a son finally acting on a grievance that had been suppressed for 20 years? As the power shifted, the message from the new Duke was about to become unmistakable. Prince William did not call a press conference, nor did he issue a dramatic decree to announce the new direction of his reign. Instead, he waited for the cold, impartial machinery of the state to do the work for him. The moment of reckoning was hidden within the pages of a dry, technical document, the annual financial report of the Duchy of Cornwall. This is a record that very few people outside the inner circles of London's financial district ever bother to read, yet for those who knew where to look, it contained a revelation that echoed through the palace like a thunderclap. For 20 years, the name of Annabel Elliot had been a constant presence on those ledger sheets. But in the first full year of William's tenure as the Duke of Cornwall, her name had simply vanished. There was no public farewell, no official thank you for 2 decades of service, and no ceremony to mark the end of an era. She was gone. To be clear, Annabel was not merely a family favorite, she was a woman of significant professional standing in her own right. In 2014, she had been named the 5th most influential female interior designer in the United Kingdom. Her aesthetic was woven into the very fabric of the royal portfolio. She had designed the interiors of 12 holiday cottages on the Isles of Scilly, transformed the Llywelyn estate in Wales, and converted a derelict barn at Dumfries House in Scotland into a lavish guesthouse used for high-profile weddings and private events. Her work was high caliber and widely respected, yet in the new era of the duchy, professional talent was not a sufficient shield against the shifting winds of power. Royal expert Emmy Griffiths observed the situation with the kind of measured, careful language typical of palace observers, noting that William had taken her off the payroll and that the move had caused ripples throughout the household. The official line from the palace was that the decision was no reflection on her work. However, everyone within the institution understood exactly what that formulation meant. An anonymous royal source was far more blunt, describing the move as a deliberate effort to cut away royal hangers-on and reduce the lavish, unchecked spending that had characterized his father's management of the estate for decades. As Annabel was ushered out, William was busy bringing in a new guard. He began filling key positions within the duchy with people he had chosen himself, men like Harry Aubrey Fletcher and William Van Cutsum, his closest personal friends and godparents to his children. The message required no translation and no official statement. The era of Charles using the Duchy of Cornwall to subsidize the lifestyle and employment of his wife's family was over. The era of William had begun, and it would be defined by his own loyalties and his own vision of a streamlined monarchy. This was the monarchy acting as a sophisticated instrument of authority. The duchy has its own legal team, its own governance structure, and its own historical protocols, and every step William took was procedurally perfect. He did not break a single rule. He simply exercised the authority that had legally and automatically transferred to him. By removing the financial ties between the crown and Camilla's sister, he was signaling that the old arrangements, born of shadow and secrecy, no longer had a place in his world. But if the removal from a payroll was a quiet strike delivered through paperwork, what happened next would be a far more visible and public confrontation. Because while financial documents can be overlooked by the casual observer, the physical absence of a future king from a sacred family tradition cannot be ignored. To understand the full scale of the tension, we must look at the first Christmas of the new reign and the standoff that took place on the cold, private grounds of Sandringham. The conflict, once confined to the dry lines of financial ledgers, was now beginning to bleed into the public eye, manifesting in moments that no palace spokesperson could fully explain away. These were not mere accidents of timing or lapses in etiquette. They were the visible fractures of a family struggling to contain a decades-old resentment. The first major crack appeared during the most sacred of royal traditions, the Christmas gathering at Sandringham. For generations, Sandringham has served as the stage where the monarchy presents its most polished image of unity to the world. It is a time of carefully choreographed walks to church and communal lunches in the grand dining room. However, during the first Christmas of the new reign, the choreography broke down. Queen Camilla decided to extend an invitation to her son from her first marriage, Tom Parker Bowles. While this might have seemed like a gesture of family inclusivity, it carried a sharp edge. Reports surfaced that William had made his position undeniably clear. If Tom was present at the main family gathering, William would not attend. It was a direct challenge to Camilla's influence, but she did not yield. Tom himself later confirmed to the press that his mother had personally insisted on his presence, claiming she had not spent a holiday with him in a long time. She chose her biological son over the comfort of the future king. Consequently, William did not attend the main lunch at the big house. Instead, he, Catherine, and their children remained at Anmer Hall, their private residence on the estate. The symbolism was staggering. Camilla had effectively pushed the heir to the throne out of his own family's central holiday celebration at an estate he would one day legally own. The tension reached a fever pitch in September 2025 during a high-profile state visit to Windsor Castle. As the cameras tracked the movements of the world's most powerful leaders, they caught a brief, unsettling exchange that would soon go viral across the globe. Catherine was engaged in a warm, natural conversation with Melania Trump, the high women appearing genuinely comfortable in each other's company. From the side of the frame, Camilla entered the space. What happened next lasted only 1 second, but its impact was permanent. Camilla raised her hand and made a short, firm, dismissive motion toward Catherine. It was not a verbal command, but the body language was unmistakable. It was a signal to move, to step aside, to leave the conversation. Body language expert Judy James described it bluntly as the act of someone pulling rank and shooing the future queen away. Within hours, millions of people had watched the clip, slowing it down and replaying it to confirm what they had seen. It was a public dismissal captured in high definition. Behind the scenes, the reaction was described as immediate and intense. While William had spent years maintaining a measured, diplomatic distance, this was different. One source close to the prince stated that this moment crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This was no longer a private disagreement, it was a public message sent to the entire world about who held the power in the current household. These visible consequences, the declined Christmas invitation and the dismissive gesture at Windsor, had moved the struggle out of the shadows. The mask of unity was slipping, revealing a deeper, more urgent reality. But even as these public sparks flew, an even more intimate and high-stakes conversation was unfolding behind closed doors, one that involved a dying king and a plea for a mercy that William might not be ready to grant. While the public focused on the visible sparks of friction at Windsor and Sandringham, a far more intimate and consequential drama was unfolding within the private quarters of the king. King Charles III, while actively engaged in a grueling battle against cancer, began to hold a series of quiet, urgent conversations with his heir. These were not the discussions of a monarch planning a state event, they were the raw, personal appeals of a man who realized his time might be limited. The message from the father to the son was singular and haunting. Leave Camilla alone. Protect her. Do not turn against her when I am gone. For Charles, this was the ultimate anxiety. He had spent more than half a century devoted to one woman, navigating a path through public scandal, institutional resistance, and the disapproval of his own family to place her by his side. He knew that the moment his reign ended, the protective shield of the sovereign would vanish. Camilla would no longer have the ultimate authority of a husband to guard her position. She would be at the mercy of the man who had spent his life witnessing the damage their relationship had caused. Charles was appealing to William's sense of duty and his sense of decency, asking for a mercy that ignored the decades of emotional complexity that lay between them. To understand why this request was so heavy for William to carry, one must return to the cold granite walls of Balmoral Castle in August 1997. William was only 15 years old, staying there with his brother Harry, when their father entered their room before dawn to tell them that their mother had died in a car crash in Paris. The image of those two boys walking the grounds of the estate that morning, destroyed by a grief no child should ever have to endure, is etched into the collective memory of the world. But there is a detail beneath that memory that sits like a shard of glass in the heart of the story. On the night the news arrived from Paris, the very first person Charles called was not his mother, the Queen, who was also staying at the castle. The first person he called was Camilla. She was the one who reassured him while his sons were still asleep, unaware that their mother was gone. Camilla was the first to know, the first to console, and the first to be prioritized in the shadow of the tragedy. Now, years later, Camilla walks those same grounds at Balmoral as Queen. She sleeps in the same rooms and commands the same staff. William, who will one day own every acre of that estate, has had to watch the woman associated with his mother's destruction inhabit his mother's life. When Charles asks him to protect her, he is asking William to overlook the fact that Camilla was the first person his father turned to on the worst night of his life. William's answer to his father's plea was not given in words. In the grand, stoic tradition of the monarchy, he remained composed and respectful. But his response was already being written in the cold reality of his actions. It was written in the payroll report that surgically removed Camilla's sister. It was written in the friends he hired to replace his father's old guard. It was written in the physical and emotional distance he maintained during every public ceremony. The question that began to circulate among those who watched the family closely was whether William was waiting out of loyalty to his father, or if he was simply waiting for the inevitable moment when his authority would be absolute. The restraint was deliberate, but it was not necessarily a sign of forgiveness. As the story escaped the palace walls, the public reaction would transform this private family reckoning into a global conversation that neither the king nor the queen could control. The palace walls have always been thick, designed to absorb the echoes of internal strife and project an image of unshakable stability to the world. But in the age of digital scrutiny and global connectivity, even the most fortified institutions cannot contain a story once it catches the light. The removal of Annabel Elliot from the payroll of the £1 billion estate was the catalyst that transformed a private family disagreement into a global public explosion. Initially, the British press had framed William's management of the Duchy of Cornwall as a simple matter of modern efficiency. They spoke of a young, forward-thinking duke trimming the fat and professionalizing an ancient institution. But as the patterns began to emerge, the Christmas standoff at Sandringham, followed by the uncomfortable footage from Windsor Castle, the narrative shifted with startling speed. Royal correspondents, who had spent decades speaking in riddles, began to write with a new and unusual directness. They were no longer just reporting on administrative changes, they were documenting a future king methodically dismantling the infrastructure his stepmother had spent 2 decades constructing. The expert commentary that followed was surgical in its analysis. Royal biographers and constitutional experts began to connect the dots that the palace had hoped would remain isolated. They noted that every arrangement William was canceling was one that had been born of the era of secrecy, the era of the affair. In the United States, where the memory of the Princess of Wales has never truly receded, the story resonated with a particular intensity. American media outlets, free from the traditional constraints of the British royal rota, were blunt in their assessment. They highlighted the profound irony of Diana's son now possessing the very financial engine that had funded his father's lifestyle during the years he was cheating on their mother. This international perspective fueled a massive divide on social media, where the story took on a life of its own. Millions of users engaged in a heated debate that the palace could no longer ignore. One camp argued that William was acting with justified, long overdue authority, finally bringing transparency to an estate that had been used as a private piggy bank for his stepmother's relatives. The other camp saw something far more vengeful, arguing that the targeting of Camilla's sister was a personal attack that overstepped the boundaries of institutional duty. This divide was not just ideological, it was generational. Public opinion polls and comment sections revealed a fascinating split in the national psyche. Older audiences, who remembered the raw emotion of the 1990s and the visceral impact of Diana's televised interviews, tended to see William's actions as a form of cosmic justice. For them, he was the defender of his mother's memory. Younger audiences, however, who had grown up seeing Camilla primarily as a hard-working, supportive queen, often viewed William's moves as cold and unnecessarily harsh. Throughout this explosion of public discourse, the palace remained silent. There were no official statements, no briefings to clarify the status of the Queen's family, and no attempts to soften the image of the Duke's new regime. This silence, traditionally a tool of royal power, now worked against them. It allowed every theory and every interpretation to flourish simultaneously. Constitutional analysts began to openly discuss the once taboo subject of what would happen to Camilla once Charles was gone. They pointed out that the title of Queen Consort is not an inherited right, it is a gift of the sovereign. With William's team refusing to commit to any future designations, the word Queen Dowager, the traditional title for a king's widow, began to appear in headlines, signaling a potential return to the sidelines for a woman who had fought so hard for the center stage. But as the noise reached a fever pitch, the royal family did what they have always done to signal the end of a controversy. They appeared in public, together. And that single appearance, choreographed to the final millimeter, would say more about the true state of the monarchy than 1,000 news reports ever could. In the high-stakes world of the British monarchy, there are moments when words are not only unnecessary but entirely secondary to the visual language of the state. One such moment arrived during a grand ceremonial occasion, a day of deep tradition where the entire family was forced to stand together under the relentless gaze of the world's cameras. In royal public life, nothing is accidental. Every position, every glance, and every micro-adjustment of a sleeve or a hat is part of a sophisticated vocabulary of power. On this day, the audience did not need a palace briefing to understand that the internal hierarchy had been permanently altered. The visual choreography began with the walking order. As the procession moved toward the cathedral, the spacing between the senior royals told a story of profound distance. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, walked with a bearing that was both composed and unhurried. She stood as a woman fully aware that the survival of the institution now runs directly through her and her children. Her posture did not communicate a performance, it communicated certainty. She did not need to pull rank or make assertive gestures because her rank was now written into the very atmosphere surrounding her. Beside her, William was the embodiment of professional restraint. His comportment toward Camilla was a masterpiece of royal duty, courteous in the formal, procedural way required by his position, but entirely devoid of the warmth that usually signals a genuine familial bond. He engaged with her only where the occasion absolutely demanded it, his eyes remaining fixed on the path ahead. It was not an expression of active hostility, but something far more chilling. The icy efficiency of a man who was simply fulfilling a contract. The warmth a stepson might extend to the woman who has been in his life for 20 years was gone, replaced by the precise, measured distance of a successor waiting for his turn. Camilla, for her part, navigated the occasion with the polish of a woman who had spent decades mastering the ceremonial surface. She remained every inch the Queen experienced, commanding and impeccably turned out. However, for those who had watched her across hundreds of royal appearances, there was a visible shift in her energy. The ease that once characterized her presence beside Charles seemed more effortful, as if the maintenance of the royal mask required more deliberate concentration than ever before. Every smile felt carefully sustained, a fortification against the silent, shifting tide of the room. The emotional reality of the entire documentary was encapsulated in one single, small moment during the service. As the family moved to take their seats, there was a brief exchange of glances, a split second where William's gaze met Camilla's. There was no dialogue, no handshake, and no shared smile. It was a look of mutual recognition between two people who were no longer pretending to be reconciled, but were instead managing each other within a highly sophisticated, institutional middle ground. It was a moment that confirmed they were no longer a family in the traditional sense. They were two opposing factions bound by a shared duty to a dying king. As the ceremony concluded and the family descended the stone steps, the cameras caught one final, haunting image. Camilla was shown entering her official vehicle, the heavy door closing with a dull thud. The car moved slowly away from the ancient building, a building that, like Sandringham and Balmoral, does not belong to her. The audience watched this silent departure and understood the underlying truth. She was a guest in a world that was already moving on. But what that image truly meant would only become clear once the final, most devastating vulnerability of her position was revealed, a trap she had built with her own hands years ago. From the outside, the life of Queen Camilla appears to be a fortress of absolute permanence. She is the president or patron of more than 90 charities, the holder of a title that commands global respect, and the occupant of the grandest palaces in Britain. She moves with the assurance of a woman whose place in history is settled. But this version of her life is a sophisticated illusion, maintained entirely by the fragile heartbeat of a king. Every element of her current security, from the servants who bow to her to the very roof over her head, is tethered to one man, and that man is facing a battle that no monarch, regardless of their power, can ultimately win. To understand the true precarity of her position, one must look past the ceremonial titles and into the cold reality of property law. Most of the world assumes that estates like Sandringham and Balmoral belong to the British government or the state. They do not. They are not crown properties managed by a national institution. They are private assets, owned in the same way a family home is owned by an individual. Queen Elizabeth II inherited both from her father, King George VI. When she passed away in September 2022, they passed directly to Charles. When Charles dies, they will pass directly and automatically to William. Together, these two estates are worth more than £200 million. They are the private sanctuaries of the royal family, yet Camilla does not own a single brick of either. The moment Charles takes his final breath, the transfer of this empire to William is instant. In that same second, the title of Queen passes to Catherine. Camilla will become the Queen Dowager, the widow of a king. While it is a title of respect, it carries no constitutional power and no inherent right to remain in the home she currently calls her own. William has spent his life watching the mechanism of royal titles being used as both a shield and a sword. He was there when his father stripped Diana of her title, Her Royal Highness, after their divorce. He knows exactly how these designations can be given and how they can be taken away. Whether Camilla is allowed to continue living at Sandringham or Balmoral, or whether she is relegated to a lesser, more distant residence, will be a decision that rests entirely within William's discretion. There is no legal document and no constitutional protection that guarantees her a seat at the table. But the final, most devastating detail of this story is not what William might do, it is what Camilla has already done to herself. For years, she possessed one piece of property that was uniquely and legally hers. Ray Mill House, a private home in Wiltshire. She spoke of it as her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the rigid protocols of royal life and find therapy in her own garden. It was her insurance policy, her one guarantee of independence. But she sold it. In an effort to signal her total commitment to her royal role and her place beside Charles, she gave up the only home that was truly hers. In doing so, she unwittingly completed the architecture of her own vulnerability. When Charles dies, she will have no private ground of her own to retreat to. She will live where William decides she should live. The woman who spent 20 years quietly engineering her way to the very top of the most powerful family in Britain, who managed the press, shaped what a king believed about his own sons, and outlasted every version of every promise made against her, had sold the only home she truly owned, and in doing so had built the one trap in her life that nobody else could open. She had handed the keys to the man she spent 20 years making an enemy of, and now she had to wait and see whether he would let her in.